Hey everyone, welcome back. Imagine stepping into a world where your every breath and every bite feels like a luxury. That's the Middle Ages. It wasn't knights and castles like in movies. It was mostly peasants scraping by, often one failed, harvest away from disaster. Today, I want to walk you through that life, from the moment you wake up in your muddy hut to the end of your day, exhausted, hungry, and still worrying about tomorrow. I want this to feel like you're there with them, feeling the cold stone under your feet, tasting the thin gruel they ate, sensing their fear of the unknown. Because honestly, their lives were brutal, and yet amazing things happened. They built communities, they held on to hope, they believed, and they survived. To spark your curiosity about how we got from then to now, so picture it, a peasant village nestled in a valley, wooden huts with thatched roofs, standing close together, like family, huddling for warmth. Outside your hut, there's a small patch of land, your entire livelihood. You're bound to it. Your labor belongs to the Lord. You work from sunup till sundown, either in the fields or for the Lord, taking half or more of whatever you produce. And if the harvest fails you, birth, death, religion, fear of disease, and fear of punishment shaped every moment. Your children might not make it past infancy. Your wife will bear several children, each pregnancy risking her life. You know nothing of doctors. A chill or a fever that today we brush off might kill back then. Your body aches constantly, washing rarely. Rats, fleas, and lice are part of daily life. And the church watches over every thought and action, letting you believe that suffering is good for your soul, that everything miserable has a purpose because questioning it might get you in trouble. Yet people laughed, sang, danced at festivals. They told stories by firelight. They found community in suffering, that resilience shaped history. But for now, we start at the beginning, childhood. Imagine a 5-year-old running outside before sunrise, fetching firewood, carrying water, helping the older siblings churn butter or grind grain, too young to play, too young to rest. A child whose future is set before they can even write their own name. Every kid knows the weight of the plow by 10, knows fear of punishment for laziness or theft. Imagine that, but all that comes in the next section. This first bit, I just wanted to ground you, to invite you in. That's medieval peasant life. Stark, relentless, unforgiving. But let's really step into the shoes of a medieval peasant now. Most of the population, the overwhelming majority, in fact, lived, lives so far removed from privilege that the word hard doesn't even come close. There's no mattress, no pillow, maybe a blanket, if you're lucky, made from rough wool that scratches your skin, and the sky's still dark outside. You hear the sound of livestock rustling in the shed next to your hut. Maybe a baby is crying. You've got to tend to the animals, prepare what little food there is, gather water from the well. And that's all before the sun even rises. This is life, day after day, season after season. The hut you live in isn't anything like a house. It's more like a single room made of wood and mud. There's no separation, no privacy. You live, eat, and sleep in the same space, often with your animals during colder months, because their body heat might help keep the place from freezing. There's no chimney. Smoke from the fire fills the room and clings to your clothes, your skin, your lungs. But that fire is everything. It cooks your food. It's your only source of light after dark, and it keeps you from freezing to death, just barely. And the foodlets talk about that. You don't have a pantry full of choices, no spice rack, no sweet treats. If you're lucky, you get some bread made from coarse grains, maybe a bit of pottage, basically a thin soup of vegetables. Sometimes with a piece of salted meat if there was a festival recently, or if your family managed to trap something small. Hunger is constant. It dulls your thoughts and makes your body heavy. There's no such thing as eating until you're full. You eat until the food runs out, then get back to work. Your life is ruled by seasons, not like today, where we enjoy winter fashion or summer holidays. Seasons back then decided whether you would survive. Spring meant planting, long days bent over soil. Summer meant relentless heat and more work. The cold crept in through every crack. The fire barely kept the hut warm. Food ran low. Sickness spread easily. Winter didn't just mean discomfort. Most of it isn't even for you. You don't own the land you work. You're bound to it, and everything you produce gets divided up. The Lord takes his share first, usually the largest. The church, maybe just enough to keep your family alive, maybe. And the Lord, he controls everything. He can tax you, punish you, even take your children as servants. You owe him service, obedience, and sometimes your life if he decides to raise a militia. Your family has probably been working his land for generations. Well, in bits and pieces. A wedding in the village might mean music, dancing, and extra food. Church festivals gave people a rare chance to rest. There were games, simple ones, usually involving chasing, throwing, or wrestling. Life was harsh, yes, but never empty. Still, that harshness was always close. If your child fell ill, there was no doctor, just herbs, prayers, and hope. If your livestock died, you might not survive the winter. If a noble passed by, you bowed your head and stepped aside, hoping not to draw attention and the fear. It wasn't just physical. There was the constant pressure of religion. You were told your suffering was holy, that obedience was godly, that questioning your place in the world was sinful. You were born to serve, they said, and so you served. But still, there was a quiet strength. In these people, a quiet kind of bravery. They didn't fight grand battles or write history books, but they endured. Don't think of shiny armor and royal banquets. Think of the peasant woman bending over a field with cracked hands. Think of the child carrying water before sunrise. Think of the man huddled near a dying fire, hoping the food stretches just one more day. That was the Middle Ages for most people. That was life. Hard, cruel, but lived all the same. Imagine you're born in a small village in the Middle Ages. There's no birth certificate, no photo, no announcement. Just your mother, maybe a village midwife, and the dim light of a smoky fire. That's it. If you survive your first week, you're lucky. If you survive your first year, you're a miracle. Infant mortality was so common, it was almost expected. Diseases, malnutrition, poor hygiene, any of them could take your life before you ever took your first steps. But let's say you survive. From the moment you can walk your childhood at, there's no school to attend, no toys to play with, no time to wonder. You learn by doing, by watching, by helping. If your parents farm, you're in the fields. If they raise livestock, you're feeding the animals. You might be 5 or 6 years old, already doing real work, hauling water, collecting firewood, feeding chickens, or keeping an eye on younger siblings. There's no room for rebellion. No, I don't want to. Work isn't optional. If you don't help, someone else has to work harder. There's always something to do, and no one is coming to entertain you or give you time off. If you're lazy, you're scolded. If you're clumsy, you're punished. Everything is about survival, and every hand, even a small one, counts. Clothing. You wear what's been handed down, patched over and over again. Shoes are rare. Winters are especially hard. Your fingers and toes go numb. Your nose is constantly dripping, but you still have to do your chores. No one is coddled. There's no warm bath waiting for you. No bedtime stories. If you're lucky, you sit by the fire while someone tells an old tale, but most nights you fall asleep, tired, hungry, and sore. There's no formal education unless you're extremely fortunate. Maybe the village priest teaches a few boys to read the Bible in Latin, but girls almost never. You don't learn to write your name. You don't learn history or science or math. You learn how to survive, how to knead dough, how to dig a trench, how to stitch a tunic, how to tell when the sky means rain. You learn by repetition, passed down through generations. There's no school bell, just the rhythm of chores. But that doesn't mean you don't play. Children still found small pockets of joy. They played with sticks, rocks, hoops made from branches. They wrestled, raced, and made up games. Laughter wasn't banned. It just had to fit between responsibilities. You might carve a toy from wood or chase a piglet around for fun, but only if the work was done. Only if your parents weren't watching too closely. And the thing is, you're always being watched by your parents, yes, but also by your neighbors. Villages were small. Everyone knew everyone. If you misbehaved, news of it spread fast. Discipline wasn't always gentle. You could be slapped, strapped, or shamed. It wasn't cruelty as much as it was routine. Children were treated more like small adults than precious, delicate beings. By age 10, you were expected to act like a grown-up in many ways. You might be sent to work on another farm. You might take care of younger children. You might already be betrothed. Marriage could be arranged early, and although it usually wasn't until the teens, the pressure to grow up came fast, especially for girls. Girls were taught to cook, clean, spin wool, tend to baby skills they'd need as wives and mothers. And boys, they learned to dig, build, chop, obey. That was their future, and still, even in this harsh world, children bonded. They created their own world in the cracks between chores. They made friendships, formed rivalries, shared secrets. They learned to hide when they didn't want to work. They played in the mud. They laughed when someone tripped and cried when a chicken died. They were still human, still children, but innocence never lasted long. By 12 or 13, most kids were fully immersed in adult life. Girls could be married, especially in poorer families where mouths needed to be fed. Boys were expected to work full-time. Childhood faded fast, replaced by the endless cycle of labor and survival. Sometimes, tragedy struck. A sibling died, a parent was injured, a crop failed. You learned quickly how fragile life was. There were no hospitals, no safety nets, just the village, the church, and hope. So when you think of childhood in the Middle Ages, don't picture it with bright colors and playroom. Picture dirt floors and heavy buckets. Picture cold mornings and hungry nights. Picture a small figure in oversized clothes trying to keep up with the world. That was the reality. That was childhood. Asterisk, it's still dark when your eyes open. Fire has long gone cold, and the air inside your one-room hut is thick with the chill of early morning. Your muscles ache before you even move. You slept on straw again. Your children are still curled up beside you, wrapped in whatever cloth you could spare. Your stomach growls. You ignore it. That's just the beginning of your day. You reach for your clothes knot, a fresh outfit, but the same tunic you wore yesterday, and probably the day before that. It smells of smoke, sweat, and earth. You step outside. The frost is still on the grass. The animals need feeding. The fire needs relighting. Water needs fetching. There's no tap, no stove. Everything has to be done by hand, from scratch. Every single day taught first. You walk to the well. It's cold, and your fingers are stiff, but water must be carried before anyone can eat or wash or begin the chores. Maybe your youngest trails behind you, still rubbing sleep from their eyes. You fill the bucket and carry it home. It's heavy. Your back already hurts, and the sun hasn't even risen. You start the fire next. Some twigs, maybe a bit of leftover. Charcoal, if you were lucky yesterday. It takes time. Sometimes it doesn't catch, but eventually you manage. There's warmth. You boil water. Maybe add a handful of oats or barley. Breakfast isn't a feast, it's survival. Thin gruel. No sugar, no milk. Just something warm to fill your belly before the work begins. If you're a man, your day means fields. Always the fields. Whether it's spring planting, summer weeding, autumn harvesting, or winter maintenance, your time is owed to the land. You work long hours, bending, digging, carrying. You don't stop until it's too dark to see. Your hands are rough, your nails cracked, your back permanently sore. There's no break, no weekends, no escape. If you're a woman, your day is just as hard, maybe harder. You're cooking, mending, spinning, caring for children, feeding animals, tending gardens, carrying water, cleaning everything by hand. You don't rest. Even when you sit, you're spinning wool or nursing a baby. If you're lucky, your older children help. If not, it's all on you. Your children, by the way, aren't idle. Once they're strong enough to carry a bucket or swing a tool, they join in. Maybe they herd animals or help in the fields. Maybe they care for younger siblings. They don't go to school. They don't play all day. Childhood is a short window then. It's labor. Midday comes, and if the Lord allows, you pause for a quick meal. Again, it's simple. Maybe some black bread, a piece of onion, if you're lucky, a bit of cheese, water or ale to drink clean. Water isn't always safe, and ale is weak, but more reliable. There's no variety, no indulgence, just fuel to keep going. The afternoon is more of the same. Back to the fields, back to the loom, back to the grind. Your body is tired, but there's more work to do. Maybe the pigs have escaped. Maybe the firewood is running low. Maybe your neighbor needs help repairing a roof, and you can't say no. In the village, everyone depends on each other. You can't afford enemies. As the sun sets, you head back home. Your arms are heavy. Your feet are sore. The hut smells of smoke and animals. You eat again whatever is left from earlier. Maybe pottage, maybe bread. It's warm. that's something. You talk a little about the weather, about the crops, about who's sick, about the church feast coming soon. There's no privacy, so everyone hears everything. Maybe you pray, maybe you don't, the church says. You must, that you're a sinner by birth and suffering is holy, that your reward is after death. So you bow your head, hoping it's true, then sleep. Not because you want to, but because your body demands it. You lie back on the straw. You pull the blanket up around your shoulders. You close your eyes, already dreading the cold of morning, already feeling the weight of tomorrow. This was your life, day after day, season after season. No rest, no escape, but also routine, stability, purpose. There's something grounding about it, even in the hardship. You knew your role. You knew what to expect. You were part of something. That was the daily rhythm of a medieval peasant. A grind, yes, but a shared one. Everyone worked, everyone suffered, everyone hoped, and in that shared rhythm, in that constant struggle, they found endurance. And through endurance, they shaped the foundation of the world we live in today. Let's talk about food. Not feasts and banquets, not silver platters and roasted boars. That was the world of kings and lords. For the average medieval peasant, food was about one thing: survival. The idea of 3 meals a day was a luxury. They didn't have. You ate what you had when you had it. And if the season or the harvest didn't cooperate, you didn't eat much at all. Bread was the foundation of nearly every meal. Not the soft, fluffy bread we know today, but heavy, coarse. Loaves made from rye, barley, or oats. Sometimes it was so hard you had to soak it in broth just to chew it. The flour was ground with stones, and it wasn't uncommon to bite into a piece and crack a tooth on a bit of grit. But bread filled your belly, and that's all that mattered. With the bread came pottage, a thick stew made from whatever vegetables were available: onions, leeks, cabbage, maybe turnips. If you had a garden, you ate from it. If you didn't, you foraged. Herbs like nettles or wild garlic were common. It was rarely seasoned with anything more than salt. If you had any, spices were expensive. They were for the wealthy. You had to be creative. Protein, rare and precious. Most peasants didn't eat meat often. Maybe some salted pork during a festival. Maybe a bit of bacon if you raised a pig and could spare it. More likely, you'd get your protein from beans or peas. Eggs were a treat. Milk was more often turned into cheese or butter to make it last. Chickens were kept mostly for their eggs, and killing one for meat was a decision not taken lightly. Fish was more common if you lived near a river or coast, but even then, church rules dictated when you could eat meat and when you couldn't. There were many fasting days times when eating meat was forbidden, so people had to rely on fish, eggs, or dairy if they had access. Now imagine winter. The crops are gone. The garden is dead. If you didn't preserve enough food during the summer through salting, drying, or storing in cellars, then you're in trouble. You ration, you stretch every meal, you eat less, you go to sleep hungry. Some winters were so harsh that people boiled tree bark or chewed on old leather just to quiet the ache in their stomachs. And famine was always looming. A single bad harvest could throw an entire region into crisis. No rain, too much rain, a sudden frost, disease among the crops. Any of these could mean disaster. And famine didn't just mean less food, It meant the poor fighting over scraps. It meant crime. It meant death. Sometimes whole villages would be wiped out, not by war or plague, but by empty stomachs. In the worst years, starvation pushed people to desperate choices. There are records of people eating grass, roots, even dirt. Some stole from neighbors. Some sold everything they had for a few loaves of bread. Some simply lay down and waited to die. Hunger changes people. It breaks down dignity. And in the Middle Ages, it was always close by, but food was also tied to community. When there was enough, it was shared. During harvest festivals or holy days, people came together to cook and eat what they could spare. A bit of meat, a pie, ale, brewed at home. It wasn't much, but it was joy. A break from the grind, a reason to celebrate. Drinks. Water wasn't always safe. It could be contaminated with waste or bacteria, especially near towns. So people often drank ale weak, homemade, and far less alcoholic than what we know today. Children drank it. It was safer than water and gave a few extra calories. Milk was used sparingly, mostly from goats or cows, and usually turned into cheese or butter to make it last longer. And then there was the role of the church. The church didn't just dictate when you could eat meat, they also collected tithes. 10% of everything you produced, including food, went to the church. That meant the peasants, already scraping by, had to give up part of their harvest even during lean years. Refusing wasn't an option. It was considered a sin. Despite all this, people learned to adapt. They learned how to preserve what little they had. They planted wisely, saved seeds, shared with neighbors when possible. They developed incredible resilience. A meal might be meager, but it was eaten with gratitude because having something was better than nothing. And still, even in times of scarcity, people found moments of joy. A fresh loaf of bread, a rare piece of meat on a feast day, a cup of warm broth on a cold night. These small comforts mattered more because they were rare. They reminded people that life, however hard, still had flavor. So next time you sit down to eat, imagine doing it without choice. No menu, no snacks, no seconds, just what you had, what you could grow, what you could trade. That was food in the Middle Ages, simple, scarce, and always uncertain. But it kept them alive, and sometimes that was enough. In the Middle Ages, being a woman meant living within limit, strict, unspoken, and often unfair. From the moment you were born, your path was shaped not by what you wanted, but by what society expected of you. Your worth was measured by your ability to marry, to serve, to obey. But that's not the whole story, because within those limits, women found ways to endure, to adapt, and sometimes even to resist. Most women were peasants, just like most men. They lived in villages, worked the land, raised children, and carried the weight of daily survival. Their day started before the sun rose and ended long after it set. Cooking, cleaning, tending animals, fetching water, making clothes, it was endless. Every task was done by hand, often with children at your side or a baby on your hip. You didn't get to rest. Even in pregnancy, you worked. Even in childbirth, there was little help. And yet, women kept the home running. Without them, nothing would function. Their labor wasn't recognized as valuable by society, but it was absolutely essential. Marriage was expected. Very few women remained single. If you were born to a peasant family, your parents might arrange a match when you were still a child. The goal wasn't love, it was survival. A good marriage meant security, maybe a bit of land, maybe peace between families. You probably married in your early teens. Your husband was likely older. Once married, you became your husband's property in the eyes of the law. You couldn't own land without special permission. You couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't even speak in some legal matters. If your husband beat you, no one would intervene unless it was extreme. If he died, your future depended on whether he left you anything or if his family would take you in. Your job was to bear children, as many as possible. Infant mortality was high, and the more children you had, the better the chance that some would survive. But childbirth was dangerous. Many women died giving birth. Many more suffered long-term injuries. There were no hospitals, no pain relief, no doctors, just midwives and prayer. Education. Rare noble girls might be taught to read or sew. But most girls learned from their mothers how to cook, how to keep a fire going, how to preserve food. If you were lucky, maybe you learned to spin wool or make cloth, which could earn a bit of money. But books, writing, learning, those were for men, especially in the church. And speaking of the church, had very clear ideas about women. Eve had sinned first, they said. Women were weaker, more emotional, more likely to tempt men into sin. That's why women had to be modest, obedient, silent. That's why they had to cover their hair, walk behind their husbands, ask permission. The church praised virginity, but also demanded fertility. Women were caught in a double standard, praised for purity, punished for desire. But not all women fit this mold. Some joined convents. For them, the church offered a kind of place where women could live outside marriage, where they could read, write, pray, and sometimes lead. Nuns ran schools, copied manuscripts, cared for the sick. Some became abbesses with real authority over lands and people. The convent was one of the few places where a woman could live with a degree of independence and respect. In noble families, women had more status, but also more control placed upon them. A noblewoman might manage an estate while her husband was away at war. She might oversee dozens of servants, handle finances, even defend a castle in times of siege. But still, her life was shaped by alliances and appearances. She was a pawn in political marriages. Her beauty, her behavior, her ability to bear sons-all were under constant scrutiny. Some women, though, broke through. Women like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who defied kings, led armies, and shaped history. Or Hildegard of Bingen, a nun and scholar, whose writings still inspire. Or Joan of Arc, who led French troops into battle and claimed divine visions. These were exceptions, but they showed that even in a world built to silence women, some voices still rose in towns and cities working. Women were more visible. They brewed ale, spun thread, sold goods in markets, baked bread. Widows sometimes ran businesses. Wives of craftsmen often helped in the trade. There were even female doctors, though they were rarely officially recognized, and midwives, they were essential. They helped women bring life into the world. They passed down knowledge from one generation to the next. But even this had risks. A woman who knew too much, who healed too well, who spoke too freely, she could be accused of witchcraft. Superstition ran deep. Miscarriages, illness, even bad weather, these could all be blamed on a woman seen as different. Many lived in fear of being singled out, especially as they aged. Despite everything, women found ways to endure. They formed networks with other women, sharing skills, stories, support. They passed down traditions. They raised children who would become the next generation of laborers, soldiers, or servants. They survived wars, plagues, famines, and grief. And through it all, they kept life moving. Their names weren't always recorded. Their stories weren't always told. But they were there in every village, every town, every field, and fire-lit home, quietly shaping history, not with power, but with persistence. So when we look at the Middle Ages, we can't just talk about kings and knights. We have to remember the women, the invisible backbone of society, the ones who bore the weight of the world and kept going, because even when the world told them they didn't matter, they did. In the Middle Ages, getting sick was more than just unfortunate, it was terrifying. People didn't understand germs or viruses. They didn't have antibiotics, vaccines, or reliable doctors. Medicine was a strange mix of ancient theory, superstition, and a lot of guessing. And most of the time, it didn't work. Imagine waking up with a fever. Your body aches. You can barely move. Today, you'd go to a doctor, maybe get a blood test or some medication. But in the medieval world, illness wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. People believed that sickness was caused by sin, by bad air, or by an imbalance of fluids in the body, known as the four humors. Those humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And yellow bile came from ancient Greek medicine. Doctors believed that everyone had these four substances in their body, and that health depended on keeping them in balance. Too much black bile, you might feel depressed. Too much phlegm, you'd be sluggish or cold. Treatments focused on restoring balance, not curing specific diseases. And how did they restore balance? Bloodletting was one of the most common methods. A physician, or more likely a barber surgeon, would cut you open or use leeches to drain your blood. The idea was to release the bad blood causing the illness. Sometimes this helped, but often it made things worse. People got weaker. Sometimes they died from the treatment itself. Herbal remedies were another common tool. Medieval healers, often women, used plants like lavender for calm, garlic to fight infection, or willow bark for pain relief. Some herbs did help, but others were useless or even harmful. With no regulation or testing, medicine was mostly trial and error, sometimes literally. If your illness was more serious, you might be taken to a monastery or a small hospital. But don't picture a clean, quiet place. These hospitals were more like hospicized for rest, not recovery. They had no real medical equipment, and many were run by monks or nuns who focused on prayer, not science. You'd be given a bed, some soup, maybe a blessing. If you recovered, it was seen as a miracle. If you died, it was God's will. And then there was the plague, the Black Death. In the mid-1300s, it swept across Europe, killing millions. Whole villages were wiped out. Bodies piled up in the streets. No one knew what caused it. Some blamed bad air. Others said it was a punishment from God. People fled cities. Some turned to religion, whipping themselves to beg for mercy. Others turned to violence, blaming minority groups like Jews and accusing them of poisoning wells. Doctors wore long robes and bird-like masks filled with herbs to filter the air, but it didn't help. The disease moved too fast, and medicine was powerless. The plague changed everything. It shattered people's faith, shifted power from lords to workers, and left deep scars on society. And it showed just how helpless medieval medicine really was in the face of real disaster. But not all sickness came from dramatic epidemics. There were everyday dangers, too. A simple cut could get infected. A broken bone could mean lifelong disability. Childbirth was one of the biggest risks a woman faced without sterile tools or trained doctors. Many died in labor. Even dental pain could be unbearable. If you had a bad tooth, the solution was often to yank it out with iron tools and no painkillers. Mental illness wasn't understood at all. People who heard voices or behaved strangely were often feared, locked away, or even accused of being possessed. There was no concept of depression or anxiety. If you seemed off, people might think you were cursed or under the influence of demons. Still, some people tried to study the body. In universities, scholars began to dissect animals and, occasionally, human corpses to learn anatomy. But this was controversial and rare. The church often forbade dissection, believing the body should remain whole after death. So most medical knowledge came from books, passed down from Greek and Roman thinkers like Galen or Hippocrates. Their theories dominated for centuries, even if they were wrong. Interestingly, not all healers were trained doctors. In fact, most weren't. Village-wise women or midwives often knew more about practical care than educated physicians. They knew which plants could ease a fever or help deliver a baby. Their knowledge came from experience, not books. But because they were women, and because their healing sometimes looked like magic, they were vulnerable to suspicion and persecution. Astrology also played a big role. Doctors would consult the stars before treating a patient. They believed that celestial movements affected the body and could influence health. A bad alignment might mean it's the wrong time to perform surgery or take medicine. It sounds strange now, but back then it was seen as advanced science. Cleanliness wasn't well understood either. People didn't bathe often. Water was sometimes scarce, and many believed that too much washing could make you sick by opening your pores to bad air. Streets were filthy, waste was dumped outside, and rats were everywhere. Not exactly the healthiest environment. Still, even in the chaos, people tried. They cared for each other. Mothers comforted sick children. Villagers helped neighbors during epidemics. Monks wrote down what little they knew, hoping to help the next generation. And slowly, through centuries of pain and loss, medicine began to evolve. By the end of the Middle Ages, some progress had been made. Hospitals became more organized. Universities taught anatomy and surgery, and the groundwork was laid for the scientific revolutions to come. But for most people, getting sick in the medieval world was a gamble, a terrifying, lonely journey filled with fear, confusion, and prayer. And if you survived, was often by luck, not medicine. Asterisk. If you were born a peasant in medieval times, your life was hard from the very beginning. You didn't choose your path. You didn't rise through the ranks. You were born into the lowest class of society, and there you stayed. No dreams of luxury. No time for deep thinking. Your world was work, survival, and routine. Your day started early. Before the sun even peeked over the hills, you were up. The rooster crowed, and you had no alarm clock. Your body just knew. You might start by stoking the fire, fetching water, or feeding animals if your family had them. Breakfast was simple, maybe a piece of coarse bread and a bit of ale, or weak pottage made from grains and vegetables. Meat was rare. Then it was off to the fields. Most peasants worked on land that didn't even belong to them. You farmed for a lord, giving him a portion of your harvest in exchange for living on his land. It wasn't a choice, it was the system. You worked with wooden tools, with your hands, with oxen pulling plows through stubborn earth. There was no machinery. Everything took effort. The work changed with the seasons. Spring meant planting. Summer was endless labor under the hot sun. Autumn brought the harvest year busiest and most critical time. Winter was quieter, but not easier. You still had to care for animals, repair tools, and survive the cold on whatever food you had managed to store. And even when you weren't farming, you were still working, fixing your thatched roof, making clothes, grinding grain, brewing ale, or weaving baskets. Your hands were always busy, your body always tired. Leisure was a luxury you didn't know. Peasant homes were tiny and dark, just 1 or 2 rooms, usually made from wattle and daub, basically sticks and mud. The roof was thatch, the floor was dirt. Inside, it was smoky from the fire. There were no chimneys, just a hole in the roof. You shared this space with your whole family and, often with livestock, especially in winter. Furniture was minimal. A wooden table, maybe a bench. Beds, if you were lucky, stuffed with straw. Blankets were rare. You slept in your clothes to keep warm. Cleanliness was difficult. Lice and fleas were common. Bathing happened occasionally, usually in rivers or wooden tubs. And soap was homemade and harsh. Your clothing was simple tunic and leggings for men, long dresses for women, usually made of wool or linen. Most people had only 1 or 2 sets of clothes. Shoes were basic, often handmade and uncomfortable. If it rained, you got wet. If it snowed, you shivered. Marriage came early. Life was practical. You needed someone to help you survive, to share the labor, to raise children who would one day work alongside you. Children worked too. As soon as they could walk and talk, they had chores, fetching water, watching animals, gathering firewood. There was no childhood in the modern sense, no toys, no school, no time. You learned by doing. You learned from your parents, from your neighbors, from your mistakes. Religion was a central part of life. The village church was often the largest building around. It was where you were baptized, married, and buried. You attended Mass regularly, not just because you were devout, but because it was expected. The church shaped how you understood the world, why the crops failed, why someone died, why you had to suffer. Everything had a spiritual explanation. You paid tithes 10% of your income, even if you barely had enough for your family. The church was both a comfort and a burden. Priests told you how to live, what to believe, what to fear. Hell was always looming. Heaven was a reward, but only if you obeyed. Still, the church gave structure, community, and the hope of something better after death. Feasts and festivals were your only escape from the daily grind. Holy days gave you rest and celebration. There was music, dancing, food, and drink. These moments didn't come often, but when they did, they lit up the dull routine of life. People sang, told stories, played games. For a little while, the burdens felt lighter. Justice, however, was harsh and uneven. If you stole bread because your family was starving, you could lose a hand. If you insulted your lord, you could be thrown in the stocks, or worse. The laws protected the wealthy. If a noble hurt a peasant, little would be done. But if a peasant stepped out of line, punishment came quickly. Travel was rare. Most peasants never left their village in their entire lives. Roads were rough, forests were dangerous, and you had no reason to go far. Your entire world was a few square miles. The people you grew up with were the same ones you worked with, married, and eventually were buried beside. Still, despite the difficulty, there was resilience. Community mattered. People helped each other. If a neighbor's roof caved in, others pitched in to fix it. If someone fell ill, women brought broth or herbs. There was laughter around the fire, stories told late at night, songs sung during work. Life was hard, but not without joy. And over time, small changes began to creep in. After the Black Death, for instance, labor became more valuable. Peasants demanded better wages. Some even left their villages in search of better lives. Rebellions broke out. Slowly, the rigid system began to bend. Life didn't become easy, but it started to shift. The peasant wasn't just a laborer, he was a survivor. She was a caretaker. Together, they formed the backbone of medieval society. Without them, the castles would crumble, the lords would starve, and the entire world would fall apart. They may not have been remembered by name, but they mattered. Every field they tilled, every child they raised, every fire they kept burning, it all added up. It was their quiet strength that kept the medieval world turning. While peasants toiled in the fields, the noble class lived in a very different world, one of stone walls, servants, power, and constant responsibility. Life as a noble wasn't just about luxury and comfort, though. It came with its own demands, risks, and rituals. Castles weren't just symbols of wealth, they were machines built for survival, status, and control. Imagine waking up not in a wooden hut, but in a drafty stone chamber, high up in a castle tower. The walls were cold, even in summer. There were no glass windows, only shutters to keep out the wind. A heavy wool blanket helped you sleep through the chill. You might sleep on a feather mattress if you were wealthy enough, but even the softest bed couldn't erase the stiffness of castle life. Your day as a noble began with servants helping you dress. Clothes were a sign of rank. You wore layers linen, undergarments, richly dyed tunics, sometimes lined with fur in winter. Jewelry, belts, and embroidery showed your importance. Grooming was part of the morning ritual too. Nobles prized cleanliness more than peasants, though their version of hygiene was still limited. A bowl of warm water for washing the face and hands was typical. Breakfast was simple, but better than what commoners ate: bread, cheese, maybe eggs, or cold meat. Nobles didn't eat large meals first thing. That came later. After breakfast, your responsibilities began. If you were a lord, your time was spent managing your estate. You held court in the great hall, settling disputes between villagers or overseeing local issues. You might inspect your lands, meet with your steward, or talk to knights about training and patrols. Even if you weren't directly farming, everything depended on your ability to control and manage those who did. Military training was constant. Boys of noble birth were trained from a young age to become knights. They learned to ride, hunt, and fight with sword, lance, and bow. Jousting tournaments weren't just sport, they were practice for real battles. Warfare was always a possibility, and a nobleman was expected to be ready. Women in noble families had their own roles. Noblewomen were often responsible for the household, which meant overseeing servants, organizing food storage, and planning feasts. But their influence extended beyond domestic tasks. They managed finances when their husbands were away at war. They acted as diplomats, arranging marriages and maintaining alliances. Many were educated in reading and writing, especially in religious texts. Meals were a big part of daily life. Dinner, what we'd call lunch, today was the main event. It happened around midday in the great hall. Long wooden tables were set up, covered with cloth. Servants brought out course after course meat, fish, pies, bread, vegetables, stews. There were no forks, only knives and fingers. Trenchers' thick slices of bread were used as plates and then given to the poor afterward or fed to dogs. Music, jesters, or traveling entertainers often performed during meals, especially when guests were present. Feasting was both a pleasure and a political tool. Inviting the right people, seating them carefully, showing off your wealthy at all reinforced your power. After the meal, you might go hunting or hawking. These weren't just hobbies, they were symbols of nobility. Only lords had the right to hunt certain animals, and falconry was a prestigious skill. A nobleman on horseback, with his hawk on his arm, was an image of elite status. Evenings were slower. You might read, play chess, or listen to poetry. Some nobles kept chaplains or tutors who helped them study Latin, philosophy, or theology. Letters were written, alliances maintained, and plans made. A fire would be lit in the hearth to keep away the damp chill. You'd wind down the day with evening prayers before retreating to your chambers. Castles themselves were more than homes. They were fortresses. Thick stone walls, moats, drawbridges, arrow slits, and towers all had one purpose: protection. Life inside the castle was never fully relaxed. Danger could come from rival lords, bandits, or even peasant revolts. So even in times of peace, castles were designed for defense. The layout of the castle reflected the social order. The lord and lady lived in the upper rooms, away from noise and smells. Servants slept wherever space allowed in floors, near the kitchen or in storage rooms. Kitchens were often in separate buildings to reduce fire risk. The great hall was the heart of the castle where meals, celebrations, and legal proceedings all took place. Children of nobles were raised with care, but also with clear expectations. Boys were sent to serve as pages in other noble households, learning etiquette, swordplay, and loyalty. Later, they became squires, assisting knights, before finally being knighted themselves. Girls were taught household management, embroidery, music, and the skills needed to be good wives and political assets. Marriages were arranged early and based on land, wealth, and alliances, not love. A noble daughter might be betrothed before she reached her teens. Her marriage could determine the future of her family's influence. Dowries were carefully negotiated. Weddings were less romantic and more strategic, like signing a contract between two kingdoms. Despite the luxuries, life wasn't without fear. Illness could strike anyone. Plague didn't care about class. Childbirth was dangerous, even for Noblewomen and political power could vanish overnight. A single war, a lost alliance, or a king's disfavor could cost you your land or your life. Still, nobles had privileges others didn't. They could read, they had leisure time, they ate well, dressed richly, and lived with a sense of authority. Their names were remembered in records. Their stories were passed down. Their lives, though not always easy, were far removed from the grinding poverty of the peasantry, and through all the layers of stone, silk, and steel, one truth remained: the castle wasn't just a building, it was a way of life, a symbol of order in a chaotic world, a fortress of power, and a home that echoed with the sounds of footsteps on stone, banners in the wind, and the constant whisper of history. Justice in the medieval world wasn't fair, and it certainly wasn't gentle. It was swift, brutal, and often terrifying. Laws were made by the powerful, and punishments were designed not just to correct behavior, but to scare everyone else into obedience. If you lived in these times, even a small mistake could cost you dearly. Fear of punishment shaped how people lived, how they spoke, and even how they thought. There was no police force like we know today. Instead, law enforcement was carried out by local lords, sheriffs, and appointed. In villages, the manorial court handled most disputes. For serious crimes, you could be brought before a royal court, and if things went badly, well, you wouldn't forget it. Neither would anyone who watched. Imagine being accused of theft. Maybe you stole a loaf of bread, or took a chicken because your children were starving. It didn't matter why. If caught, you could be fined, whipped, put in the stocks, or even lose a hand. The idea was simple: make an example out of the guilty to stop others from doing the same. And what if you were innocent? That wasn't always enough to protect you. Evidence was often scarce, and trials could be incredibly unfair. One method of proving innocence was called trial by ordeal. In one version, you might have to hold a red-hot iron or walk barefoot across burning coals. If your wounds healed cleanly, it was seen as a sign that God had protected you on, that you were innocent. If they festered, you were guilty. Another ordeal involved water. You'd be tied up and thrown into a river or a pond. If you floated, it was believed the water rejected you, meaning you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent, but by then you might have drowned. There were also public punishments. Stocks and pillories were common. These were wooden frames that held your head and hands in place in a public square. People would throw rotten food, insult you, even spit at you. It was humiliation as punishment, and it worked. No one wanted to end up in the stocks. For more serious crimes like murder, treason, or rebellion, things got much worse. Execution was often the sentence. Beheading was common for nobles. It was seen as a more dignified way to die. For commoners, hanging was more likely. You'd be taken to a public square, a rope placed around your neck, and left to dangle. The crowd would gather, watch, cheer, or pray. But the worst punishments were saved for those who challenged authority. If you plotted against the king or led a rebellion, you might be hanged, drawn, and quartered. That meant you were hanged until nearly dead, then cut open while still alive, and your body divided into 4 parts and displayed in different places as a warning to others. It sounds unbelievable now, but it was real. The message was clear: ever go against the crown. Torture was also part of the system. especially when confessions were needed. Devices like the rack were used to stretch the body until joints dislocated. The Iron Maiden, though mostly myth, symbolized the cruelty of imagined devices. Thumbscrews crushed fingers, branding irons burned flesh. Pain was a tool of control. And yet, even in this grim world, there were forms of mercy, or at least attempts at balance. Some criminals could pay fines instead of facing bodily harm. Wealthier offenders were often given more lenient sentences, especially if they had powerful friends or land to offer. Churches offered a kind of protection to the criminal who made it to a church could claim sanctuary. For a short time, usually 40 days, they couldn't be removed by force. But after that, they had to stand trial or go into exile. Some chose to confess and be punished. Others fled the country entirely. Juries existed in some areas, though not like today. A group of local men would gather and decide a person's fate, often based on reputation, gossip, or pressure from above. There were no lawyers for the poor, no right to remain silent, and no appeal. Witchcraft was another crime that carried harsh punishments, especially during certain periods. Accusations of sorcery could lead to trial, torture, and death. Women, especially older or poor ones, were often the targets. If crops failed or disease spread, someone had to be blamed, and which was a convenient scapegoat. Even animals could be tried and punished. There are real records of pigs, goats, and even insects being put on trial for harming people or damaging property. These trials seem absurd now, but they reflected how seriously the law was taken. Everything needed order, explanation, and punishment. Despite all this darkness, some parts of medieval justice were attempts at order. Villages had watchmen who patrolled at night. People were organized into groups called tithings, responsible for each other's behavior. If someone in your group committed a crime, everyone was expected to report it or face consequences. There were also traveling judges, called circuit justices, who visited different regions to hold court. They brought a bit more consistency to legal proceedings, though corruption and favoritism were still common. Over time, changes began to appear. More written laws, more records, greater influence from Roman legal ideas. As the medieval world moved into the later centuries, justice became slightly less arbitrary. But the legacy of fear remained. To live under medieval justice was to always watch your step. Words mattered. Rumors could ruin you. Mistakes were punished swiftly and cruelly, and fairness that depended on who you were, who you knew, and whether you had the coin to buy protection. In many ways, justice in this era wasn't about truth, it was about order. The ruling class needed control. The church demanded obedience. The people needed a system, even if it was harsh. So they built one out of fear, tradition, and steel. And as you walked through your village, past the gallows, or the stocks, or heard whispers of a neighbor arrested for theft or heresy, you didn't question the system, you just thanked the heavens it wasn't you. In the medieval world, belief wasn't just personal, it was everything. It shaped how people saw the stars, the seasons, sickness, success, and suffering. Faith explained what science couldn't. Superstition filled the gaps where reason failed. And for the average person, life was lived in a delicate balance between divine protection and mysterious, often frightening forces. To begin with, Religion was the center of everything. The Catholic Church wasn't just a place to worship, it was the authority. It shaped laws, education, and even politics. Every village had a church, every town had a priest, and every soul was taught that heaven and hell were real, close, and always watching. People believed that every action had spiritual consequences. If you lied, stole, or missed Sunday Mass, you didn't just break the law, you offended God. Confession was necessary to cleanse the soul. Prayers, pilgrimages, and penance were ways to earn forgiveness. Salvation was a constant concern. The church also controlled knowledge. Very few people could read, and those who could usually learned from religious texts. The Bible wasn't available to just anyone. It was in Latin, and the church controlled its interpretation. Questioning religious authority wasn't just discouraged, it was dangerous. But belief went far beyond the church. Superstitions were everywhere. People believed in signs, omens, and magical forces. A sudden storm might be seen as punishment for sin. A failed harvest could be blamed on a curse. Illness might be caused by bad aurora, by evil spirits. Witches, demons, and ghosts were real in the minds of medieval people. You might carry a charm to ward off bad luck, or sprinkle holy water to protect your home. Crosses were carved into door frames. Bells were rung during storms to scare away devils. Black cats were feared not for their behavior, but for their supposed connection to witchcraft. Even common illnesses were tied to the spiritual world. Before the discovery of germs, people believed disease came from imbalance or divine punishment. The Black Death, for example, killed millions, but many believed it was God's wrath for humanity's sins. Some people turned to prayer. Others turned to self-punishment, beating themselves in the streets to show repentance and beg for mercy. There were also deeply rooted beliefs about the natural world. The moon affected moods and health. Certain herbs were thought to have magical properties. Mandrake root was believed to scream when pulled from the ground. Garlic could ward off spirits. A baby born during a thunderstorm might be cursed. Dreams were also taken seriously. They weren't just random thoughts, they were messages. A dream about falling might mean danger was coming. A dream of water could symbolize cleansing or rebirth. People even visited wise women or mystics to have their dreams interpreted. And then there were relics, objects believed to have holy power. A piece of a saint's bone, a splinter from the true cross, or a vial of holy water could be worth a fortune. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles just to see or touch these relics. It wasn't just faith, it was hope. Hope that a sickness might be cured, that a sin might be forgiven, that a miracle could happen. The calendar itself was shaped by belief. Each day was dedicated to a saint or religious event. People celebrated feasts and fasted at the command of the church. The rhythm of life followed the liturgical year: Advent, Lent, Easter, and countless holy days in between. Astrology was another form of belief. Even kings and nobles consulted astrologers before making major decisions. The stars were seen as guiding forces. Your birth sign could determine your personality or your fate. People believed that everything in the heavens had meaning and that human life was tied to the movement of celestial bodies. Superstitions even influenced construction. Churches were often built on high ground, facing east. Cemeteries were carefully arranged. Houses were built with charms buried under the threshold, or with special symbols carved into the beams to keep spirits away. Travelers carried iron for protection. Sailors refused to whistle on ships, fearing it would summon storms. For all their belief, medieval people also feared. They feared the unknown, the unexplained, the unnatural. And in a world without modern medicine, electricity, or reliable communication, fear was often justified. A sudden death, a stillbirth, a strange light in the sky, these weren't just events, they were signs. Even weather had meaning. A blood-red sunset might signal war. A rainbow could be a promise. Thunder was the voice of God. Lightning was his anger. People didn't just watch the world, they read it, interpreted it, and responded with prayer, ritual, and caution. But for all the fear and mystery, belief also brought comfort. It gave people a sense of control in a chaotic world. When crops failed or war broke out, faith helped them make sense of suffering. Belief turned random events into part of a bigger story, divine plan. And despite how strange some of these beliefs may seem now, they served a purpose. They provided structure, they explained the unexplainable, and they offered hope in times of darkness. In the medieval world, belief wasn't a choice, it was a way of life. It touched every moment, from the way you woke up to how you treated a stranger, to what you whispered before you slept. You weren't just living in the world, you were living under God's eye. And within the reach of unseen forces, magic and miracle, sin and salvation, heaven and hell, they weren't abstract ideas, they were real. And every heartbeat, every step, every breath was taken in awareness of the mysteries beyond human control. This deep, ever-present belief gave meaning to even the hardest lives. And though many of those superstitions have faded, with time, the longing to understand the unknown remains with us still. Asterisk. Food in the medieval world was more than just fuel. It was a reflection of your place in society, a source of celebration, and sometimes a matter of life or death. What you ate, how you prepared it, and when you ate it, all depended on who you ate. It all depended on who you were. A peasant's daily bread looked nothing like a noble's lavish feast. And the kitchen could be a place of routine survival or extravagant spectacle. For most people, especially peasants, food was simple, repetitive, and often bland. Bread was the cornerstone of every meal, made from rye, barley, or oats. Depending on the region, it was dense, coarse, and filling. Wheat bread was reserved for the wealthy, who could afford the fine flour and ovens to bake it alongside bread. Peasants ate pottage, a thick stew made of grains, vegetables, and whatever else was available. It simmered for hours, sometimes days, over an open fire. It might include onions, leeks, cabbage, or peas. Occasionally, you'd find bits of meat, usually salted or dried. But most days, meat was rare. It was expensive, and hunting was often illegal for commoners. Instead, protein came from eggs, cheese, and legumes. Chickpeas, lentils, and beans were essential. Milk, when available, was turned into butter or cheese to last longer. Fresh produce was seasonal, and storage was a constant challenge. Salt was golded preserved meat and fish, and flavored otherwise dull meals. Breakfast was light, if it existed at all. Lunch, or dinner in medieval terms, was the main meal, eaten around Midday supper, eaten before nightfall, was smaller. People ate with their hands, using knives and chunks of bread instead of plates. Spoons were common, but forks were rare until much later. Hunger was a constant shadow. A bad harvest could mean months of scraping by. In lean years, people ate bark, roots, or boiled leaves. Famine wasn't just a possibility, it was a recurring nightmare. But higher up the social ladder, food told a very different story. Nobles feasted like kings, sometimes literally. Their tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, spiced pies, and exotic fruits. Banquets were more than meals, they were displays of wealth, power, and refinement. A single feast might last for hours, with dozens of courses served between entertainment, music, and dancing. Peacocks were roasted and redressed in their own feathers. Swans were presented whole heads and necks upright. Pies might be filled with songbirds that flew out when cut open. It wasn't just about taste, it was about spectacle. Spices were a major status symbol. Cinnamon, saffron, ginger, and cloves came from far-off lands and cost a fortune. Using them generously showed you had connections and coin. Sugar, still rare in Europe, was used to make sweetmeats, syrups, and candied fruits. Honey was the everyday sweetener for most people. Alcohol flowed freely. Ale was the drink of choice for peasants, mild, nourishing, and safer than untreated water. Nobles drank wine, often imported and flavored with herbs. Mead, a drink made from fermented honey, was also popular in some regions. Feasts followed the seasons and religious calendar. Lent meant no meat, dairy, or eggs. Fish replaced flesh. On holy days, the church dictated what could be eaten and when. But even fasting was flexible for the rich. They invented clever ways to bend the rules, like making mock meat out of fish, or shaping almond paste to look like eggs. Food preparation was labor-intensive. Kitchens were hot, smoky, and dangerous. Cooks worked with open flames, boiling cauldrons, and sharp tools. They had to know not just how to prepare meals, but how to preserve ingredients, store them safely, and make them appealing. The diet of monks and nuns was surprisingly rich. While they followed fasting rules strictly, their meals were often well prepared and included fish, cheese, and bread. Monasteries had some of the best kitchens and gardens in the land. Their knowledge of herbs, brewing, and baking was extensive. Markets and fairs were the main way to get ingredients not grown at home. Towns had bakers, butchers, and fishmongers. Food was sold fresh, salted, smoked, or dried. Meat was expensive. So offal, organ meats, and scraps were more commonly sold to poorer buyers. And then there were street foods. In cities, vendors sold pies, pancakes, sausages, and ale to busy workers. These quick meals were affordable and filling, though sanitation was always a concern. Table manners varied wildly. Among nobles, there were rules: no elbows on the table, no talking with your mouth full, and always wash your hands before eating. Among peasants, it was more practical. Eat while it's hot, share what you have, and don't waste a crumb. Food was also tied to medicine. The theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile meant certain foods were thought to affect your health and mood. Hot foods were balanced with cold ones, dry with wet. Doctors prescribed diets to treat illness, and meals were planned around keeping your humors in harmony. In times of celebration, marriages, births, victories, the table became the heart of joy. Bread was broken, wine poured, and songs sung. A good host was remembered, praised, and admired. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was identity, culture, and community. But beneath all the flavors and festivities, the truth was simple. What you ate told the world who you were. A crust of bread or a golden goblet of wine, it all depended on birth, luck, and power. And while the medieval diet may not appeal to modern tastes, it carried stories, traditions, and survival with every bite. For the average medieval peasant, life was hard, repetitive, and rooted in the land. There were no shortcuts, no conveniences, and almost no escape from the endless rhythm of survival. Yet within that struggle was a deep sense of community, routine, and meaning. The world of the peasant wasn't glamorous, but it was the backbone of medieval society. Most peasants lived in small villages scattered across the countryside. These villages were tight-knit communities, usually built around a church, a manor, house, and a few dozen simple homes. The homes were made of wattle and daub wooden frames packed with mud and straw. Roofs were thatched, windows were tiny or non-existent. Inside, it was dark, smoky, and cramped. A single room often housed an entire family. There was no privacy, no personal space. The floor was dirt. Chickens might wander indoors. Pigs might be kept nearby. Furniture was minimal: table, stools, maybe a bed stuffed with straw. Most people slept fully clothed under wool blankets or animal hides. Their day began early, long before the sun rose. Roosters crowed, and work began at once. There was no luxury of sleeping in. Every able body had a task. Children fetched water or gathered firewood. Women cooked, tended gardens, and looked after animals. Men worked the fields, repaired tools, or handled heavier labor. Farming was everything. Most peasants were bound to the land they didn't own if they worked it for the local lord. This system was called feudalism. In exchange for protection and a place to live, peasants had to give a portion of their crops, labor, or livestock to the lord of the manor. The land was divided into strips, and each family worked a few. Crops were rotated to avoid exhausting the soil. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye were common. Vegetables like leeks, onions, beans, and cabbage filled kitchen gardens. Oxen and horses helped with plowing if the family could afford them. Otherwise, it was back-breaking manual labor. Tools were simple: wooden plows, iron hoes, sickles, and scythes. Work changed with the seasons. Spring meant planting. Summer required weeding and tending. Autumn brought harvest, the most intense time of year. Winter was quieter, but still full of tasks: mending clothes, repairing thatched roofs, and preserving food. The church structured much of a peasant's life. Sundays were holy. No work was allowed. People gathered in the village church for Mass, baptized their children, married under its roof, and were buried in its yard. Priests were among the only educated people in the village. They read the Bible, delivered sermons, and often acted as moral guides and mediators. Life wasn't just toil, though. There were moments of joy. Festivals and holy days brought color and relief. May Day, Christmas, Easter, and harvest feasts allowed dancing, singing, and games. ale flowed, bread was shared, and for a day or two, worries were set aside. Music was part of village life. People played flutes, drums, or fiddles. They sang folk songs, told stories, and passed down tales around fires. Storytelling was a treasured pastime. It brought laughter, wisdom, and a sense of belonging. Still, life expectancy was low. Disease, malnutrition, and accidents claimed many lives early. Infant mortality was common. Women faced dangerous childbirth. There were no doctors, only herbalists, midwives, and village healers who relied on folk remedies, prayers, and centuries-old traditions. Clothing was functional. Wool was spun, woven, and dyed at home. Linen came from flax. Men wore tunics and leggings. Women wore long dresses with aprons. Shoes were rare and precious. Most people walked barefoot or in simple leather boots. Clothes were patched and reused until they fell apart. Hygiene was limited. Baths were taken rarely, maybe once a month. Soap was handmade from animal fat and ash. Water had to be fetched by hand from wells or streams. Laundry was beaten on rocks or scrubbed with brushes. Lice and fleas were part of everyday life. Education was non-existent for most peasants. They couldn't read or write. Knowledge was passed orally: how to plant, build, mend, or cook. A child learned by watching, helping, and doing. Boys were expected to take up their father's trade. Girls learned from their mothers how to keep a home and care for younger siblings. Marriage happened young, often by the mid-teens. Families arranged unions to strengthen ties or gain land. Dowries were exchanged. Ceremonies were simple, and homes were shared with extended family. Large families were common, but many children didn't survive to adulthood. Peasants had few legal rights. Disputes were handled by the local lord or reeve. Punishments could be harsh fines, public shaming, or even mutilation for theft. Justice depended more on status than truth. But peasants weren't powerless. When treated unfairly, they sometimes resisted refusing labor, hiding food, or even revolting. Peasant uprisings, while rare, did happen. The most famous was the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, sparked by unfair taxes and cruel laws. Despite hardship, many peasants found pride in their work. They understood the land, the seasons, and the rhythms of nature. They grew their own food, built their homes, raised their families, and made do with very little. Community was everything. Neighbors helped each other build barns, harvest crops, and survive hard winters. The village was a shared life. People knew each other's joys and sorrows. Isolation was rare, and though they had little control over politics, war, or weather, peasants shaped medieval life in quiet, enduring ways. Their labor fed cities, built kingdoms, and sustained cultures. They were the silent strength of an age, defined by castles and kings, but built on the hands of farmers. So while history often remembers the lords and knights, it was the peasants who lived the real medieval story, one of resilience, endurance, and unbreakable ties to the earth. In the medieval world, religion wasn't just a belief, was the air people breathed, the structure of society, and the lens through which every event, joy and tragedy, was understood. From the highest king to the humblest peasant, faith shaped life, death, and everything in between. The church was the center of medieval life. It wasn't just a building you visited on Sundays. It was the community hub, the legal authority, the keeper of records, the moral compass, and the spiritual gatekeeper. The church's power was absolute, and questioning it could lead to severe consequences on earth, and, more importantly to them, in the afterlife. Christianity, specifically Roman Catholicism, dominated Europe. The Pope, based in Rome, was seen as God's representative on earth. Beneath him were cardinals, bishops, priests, and monks, an entire hierarchy devoted to maintaining religious order and spreading God's word for ordinary people. The parish priest was the most familiar religious figure. He baptized their children, married their sons and daughters, heard their confessions, delivered sermons, and buried their dead. Most people couldn't read or write, so their knowledge of religion came from the priest's words, the paintings on church walls, and the rituals they participated in. Medieval people believed that everything in life was part of God's plan. If a harvest failed, it was a punishment for sin. If a child died, it was God's will. If a war broke out, it was a test of faith. There was no concept of random misfortune. Everything had spiritual meaning. Heaven, hell, and purgatory weren't abstract ideas. They were very real, vividly imagined places. Heaven was paradise, eternal joy in God's presence. Hell was eternal suffering, fire, and torment for sinners. And purgatory was a kind of waiting room, a place where souls were purified before entering heaven. People feared damnation. They wanted salvation, and the church controlled the path to both. It taught that salvation came through faith, good works, and participation in the sacraments, rites like baptism, communion, confession, marriage, and last rites before death. Mass was the central religious ceremony. It was conducted in Latin, a language most people didn't understand. But the ritual itself, the candles, the incense, the chanting created an atmosphere of mystery and awe. The Eucharist, or Holy Communion, was believed to be the literal body and blood of Christ. Receiving it was a sacred, life-defining act. Pilgrimages were also a big part of religious life. People traveled long distances to visit holy sites, like Canterbury in England or Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Some went seeking healing. Others went to show devotion, fulfill a vow, or seek forgiveness for sins. It was dangerous and costly, but deeply meaningful. Monasteries were religious communities where monks lived under strict rules. They prayed, studied, copied books by hand, and cared for the sick and poor. Monasteries preserved knowledge during a time when much of the world was illiterate. They also owned land, collected rents, and wielded economic power. Nuns lived in convents, dedicating their lives to prayer, teaching, and charity. Becoming a monk or nun was one of the few paths a person, especially a woman, could take to escape marriage or peasant life and devote themselves fully to religion. Relics were another powerful part of medieval belief. These were physical objects connected to saints' bones, clothing, or items they had touched. People believed relics had healing powers or could bring miracles. Churches proudly displayed them, and pilgrims came from far and wide to see or touch them. Saints were treated like spiritual superheroes, humans who had lived such holy lives that they now resided in heaven and could intercede on behalf of the faithful. People prayed to specific saints for protection, healing, or guidance. Saint Christopher, for example, was believed to protect travelers. Saint Anthony helped find lost things. Every village had its favorite saints, but the church was also political. It owned vast lands, collected taxes called tithes, and influenced kings and nobles. Corruption existed. Some priests and bishops lived in luxury, ignored their duties, or sold indulgences documents promising reduced punishment for sins, sometimes in exchange for money. This practice would later spark massive religious reform. But in the medieval period, it was common, superstition mixed with religion. People believed in signs, omens, and magical protections. Charms, herbs, and rituals were used alongside prayers. The line between religion and folk belief was blurry. Witchcraft was feared, though less so in the early Middle Ages than it would be later. Strange behavior, unexplained illness, or bad luck could all be blamed on sorcery or demonic influence. The church also dictated how people should live. It condemned gambling, drinking, adultery, and working on holy days. It encouraged charity, humility, and obedience. It preached that suffering in this life led to reward in the next. Heretics those who rejected church teachings were seen as dangerous, not just spiritually, but socially. Heresy could spread and undermine the very fabric of society. Heretics were tried, tortured, and sometimes executed, often by burning. The most infamous institution for rooting out heresy was the Inquisition, which began in the 13th century. Despite the fear, religion also brought comfort. It gave people purpose. It helped them make sense of hardship. It offered hope that life's pain wasn't meaningless, that after death there was peace. Art and architecture reflected this deep faith. Cathedrals soared toward the sky, filled with stained glass windows, statues, and carved scenes from the Bible. Even the illiterate could read the stories of Christ, the saints, and the Last Judgment just by looking at the walls. The calendar revolved around religious life. There were dozens of saints' days, fasts like Lent, and feasts like Christmas and Easter. Time itself was marked by bells ringing for prayer, morning, noon, evening. In times of crisis plagues, famine, war, people turned even more intensely to religion. Processions were held. Flagellants whipped themselves in public, hoping their suffering would bring divine mercy. Others blamed enemies, strangers, or marginalized groups, driven by fear and the belief that God was angry. Religion wasn't just personal, it was public, political, and powerful. It shaped law, art, science, and war. It was used to justify crusades, condemn enemies, and build empires. But most of all, it was woven into the fabric of everyday life. It helped people find meaning in their joys and endure their sorrows. It answered questions they couldn't explain and gave hope in a world full of uncertainty. In the medieval mind, God was always watching, heaven was always waiting, and the church stood between the two. When you think of the Middle Ages, castles probably come to mind, massive stone fortresses perched on hills, surrounded by moats, with banners flying high. But these castles weren't just military structures. They were homes, status symbols, political hubs, and symbols of power. And life inside them was far more complex than just knights and royalty. Early castles were made of wood, built quickly for defense after the Norman conquest. But by the 12th century, stone became the material of choice. These new castles were built to last and to impress. They sent a message. The person living here is powerful, wealthy, and not to be challenged. The basic layout of a castle included thick outer walls, a gatehouse, towers, and often a moat or ditch. Inside the walls, you'd find several buildings: the Great Hall, kitchens, storerooms, stables, and sometimes a chapel. At the center stood the Keepa, strongest, tallest structure, often used as a last refuge during an attack. Living in a castle wasn't like living in a cozy home. These places were cold, damp, and dark. Windows were small, often unglazed, and drafts were everywhere. Fireplaces helped, but heat didn't travel well in stone rooms. Tapestries hung on the walls not just for decoration, but to block out the chill. The lord and lady of the castle lived in private chambers, but private was a loose term. Servants, guards, and attendants moved in and out constantly. Privacy as we know it didn't really exist. Even the most important people shared space with others. The Great Hall was the heart of castle life. It was a massive room where meals were served, meetings held, and festivities celebrated. During the day, it was busy with activity. At night, it could turn into sleeping space for guests or servants. Meals were a major part of life. They were served in courses. Meat, fish, bread, and stews were common, depending on the season and availability. Lords and ladies sat at a raised table, while others sat lower. Food wasn't just eaten, it was performed. Meals were social, symbolic, and filled with ritual. Hygiene in castles wasn't great. Bathing was infrequent. Chamber pots were used for toilets and emptied out windows or into cesspits. Some castles had primitive latrines built into the walls called garderobes that emptied into the moat or a pit below. Castles were filled with people beyond the noble family. Servants, cooks, guards, grooms, clerks, and craftsmen all worked there. Some lived inside, others came from nearby villages. Each person had a role to play, and hierarchy was strict. Everyone knew their place. The lady of the castle wasn't just decorating rooms and hosting dinners. She often managed the household, especially when her husband was away at war. She oversaw food supplies, finances, and staff. In some cases, noble women commanded troops, defended castles, and made political decisions. Children in castles didn't exactly have a carefree childhood. Noble boys were sent away around age 7 to train as pages in other castles. They learned manners, swordplay, and horsemanship. Around age 14, they became squires, assisting knights. If they proved themselves, they were knighted. Around 20-1. Girls were taught how to run a household, manage servants, and behave with proper courtly manners. They might learn reading, embroidery, or music, depending on their family's wealth. Marriage came early, often arranged in childhood and finalized by the teen years. Castles were also places of politics. Lords held court, resolved disputes, collected taxes, and entertained important guests. Hosting a visiting noble or royal was a major event requiring feasts, performances, and days of preparation. Security was always on people's minds. Castles were designed to withstand attack. Gatehouses had portcullises, heavy metal grates that could be dropped quickly. Murder holes above doorways allowed defenders to pour boiling water or oil on attackers. Arrow slits in towers let archers shoot without exposing themselves, but sieges were brutal. Invading armies could surround a castle for weeks or months, cutting off supplies. Starvation was common. Attackers used siege engines, battering rams, trebuchets, and scaling ladders to try to breach the walls. Defenders dropped rocks, fired arrows, and waited for reinforcements. Despite their power, castles weren't invincible. Many were captured through betrayal or clever tactics. Once taken, they were often looted, burned, or repurposed. Not all castle life was grim, though. There were moments of celebration, feasts, tournaments, and music. Minstrels, jesters, and troubadours provided entertainment. Religious holidays were marked with special meals and services. Marriage feasts could last for days. Tournaments were major events. Knights competed in jousts, mock battles, and tests of skill. These weren't just sport, they were political and military training, a way to win favor, and sometimes a chance to settle disputes. Religion was present in every part of castle life. Many castles had chapels, and daily prayers were expected. Priests and monks might serve the household, offering spiritual guidance and holding mass. People believed strongly in divine protection and feared spiritual punishment. Castles also connected to the surrounding land. They controlled the villages, fields, and forests nearby. Peasants worked the land, paid rent, and owed labor to the lord. The castle was both a fortress and a center of feudal control. Trade was essential. Castles needed supplies, salt, wine, spices, fabrics, tools. Markets sprung up around them. Some castles became the heart of towns and cities that still exist today. Over time, castles became more comfortable. In later centuries, large windows, better heating, and decorative touches made them feel less like fortresses and more like noble homes. But the image of the medieval castle, cold, powerful, looming over the countryside, remains iconic, and for good reason. These structures represented everything the Middle Ages were about: power, hierarchy, faith, danger, and survival. To live in a castle was to live at the very top of the social order. But even behind those thick stone walls, life was far from easy. It was demanding, dangerous, and often dictated by politics, war, and duty. Every stone, every corridor, every tower told a story, not just of war and defense, but of people striving to live with dignity, order, and a deep sense of purpose in a world that was always changing. While castles and royalty might grab the spotlight, the real heartbeat of medieval society was the peasant. Most people in the Middle Ages were peasants, ordinary men, women, and children who worked the land, lived in small villages, and faced a daily struggle just to survive. With a thatched roof and a dirt floor, there were no windows, just small openings for light and ventilation. Furniture was sparsa wooden bench, a table, maybe a straw mattress if the family was lucky. Privacy didn't exist. The whole family, parents, children, sometimes grandparents, and even animals shared the same space. Chickens or pigs might sleep inside during cold nights. Main groups, freemen and serfs. Serfs were bound to the land. They couldn't leave the manor without the lord's permission. They worked the lord's fields, paid taxes, and gave up a portion of their harvest in exchange for protection and the right to farm a small plot. Their work revolved entirely around the seasons. Spring meant planting, plowing fields with oxen, sowing seeds by hand, Summer was time for tending crops and long days of labor in the sun. Autumn brought the harvester frantic period where everyone, even children, worked to gather food before winter wasn't restful. There were repairs to make, animals to tend, and constant worry about surviving until spring. Food was basic but filling. Bread made from coarse flour was the staple, dark, rough, and full of grit. For special occasions, they might keep chickens for eggs or pigs for slaughter once a year. Dairy products, milk, cheese, butter added variety. Drinking water wasn't always safe, so people often drank ale or weak beer, even children. It had less alcohol than today's beer and was brewed at home. Peasants might flavor their food with herbs they grew themselves, parsley, sage, or onions, but spices like pepper or cinnamon were out of reach. Clothing was simple, made from wool or linen. Men wore tunics and hose. Women wore long dresses with aprons. Most garments were homemade, dyed with plants for muted colors like brown, gray, or dull green. Shoes were rare. Many peasants worked barefoot in the fields. A peasant's life was ruled by labor, but religion shaped their worldview. They went to church every Sunday, confessed sins, and followed the church calendar. Holy days broke the rhythm of work. Festival, like Christmas, Easter, and Saints' days, were times for rest, feasting, and celebration. The church offered hope of a better life in heaven and explained suffering as part of God's plan. Peasants paid a tithe, the tenth of their earnings, or produced to the church, even when they could barely feed their families. They feared damnation, prayed for good harvests, and believed deeply in heaven, hell, and divine punishment. Superstitions also shaped daily life. People believed in signs, omens, curses, and charms to protect against bad luck or illness. Marriage usually happened young. Girls might marry by 14, boys by 16 or 17. Families arranged matches, often to strengthen ties or secure land. Wedding feasts were modest unless the family was wealthy. Husbands were expected to provide. Wives kept the household, raised children, cooked, and helped in the fields. Children were expected to work as soon as they could walk. Schooling was rare. If a child learned to read, it was usually through the church. Most peasants were illiterate, but had sharp memories and knew oral traditions. Songs and prayers by heart. Entertainment was rare but deeply cherished. Music, dancing, storytelling, and festivals provided moments of joy. Traveling entertainers, minstrels, or fairs brought excitement to village life. Games like dice, wrestling, or early forms of soccer were popular among men. Women gathered for spinning, gossiping, and sharing stories. Illness was constant. There were no doctors for the poor, only folk remedies and local healers. Common cold, infection, or injury could be fatal. Life expectancy was low. Many died in infancy, and surviving into your 40s was considered a good run. The lord of the manor controlled the land, settled disputes, and collected rents. Peasants owed him labor on his domain, the land he kept, for himself, and additional duties like repairing roads or helping during harvest. They had little legal power, but many communities had local customs and traditions that gave them some voice in how things were run. Peasant revolts did happen, especially when taxes grew unbearable or lords became cruel. The most famous was the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381, sparked by high taxes and poor treatment. Though it was crushed, it showed that peasants were not always passive. They could resist. Despite the hardship, there was resilience. Communities stuck together. People helped each other through bad harvests and shared tools and labor. Religion gave them purpose, and family gave them strength. And over time, things began to change. As towns grew and trade expanded, some peasants gained more freedom. They became merchants, craftsmen, or free laborers. With fewer workers available, being a peasant meant being at the bottom, bound by duty, defined by labor, and driven by the hope of survival. Still, without them, the entire medieval world would have crumbled. Foundation of the medieval past. Medicine in the Middle Ages was a strange blend of superstition, ancient theory, and a little bit of practicality. When someone got sick, they didn't go to a hospital or take a pill. Instead, they turned to remedies passed down through generations, advice from religious leaders, and sometimes the local barber who doubled as a surgeon. That the heart of medieval medical thinking was the concept of the four humors. This theory came from ancient Greece and was believed for centuries. According to it, the body was made up of four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant these humors were balanced. Illness, that meant something was out of balance, and the goal of treatment was to restore that balance. So, if someone had a fever, it was thought they had too much blood. The solution: bloodletting. This could be done using leeches or by cutting a vein and letting the blood flow out. People even believed that letting blood out during certain phases of the moon would be more effective. It sounds brutal now, but back then, it was seen as perfectly logical. Another common treatment was purging using herbs or other substances to make someone vomit or have diarrhea. Again, the idea was to get the bad stuff out and restore the body's balance. Many of the herbs used were quite strong, and the side effects could be worse than the illness itself. Doctors were rare and expensive. Most people couldn't afford to see one. Instead, they relied on local healers, usually women who knew about herbs and traditional remedies. These healers weren't trained in schools, but had practical knowledge from experience. Some were respected. Others, especially in times of panic or plague, were accused of witchcraft. Hospitals did exist, but they were very different from today. They were often run by the church, and their main goal wasn't to cure, but to care. Patients were offered a bed, food, and spiritual comfort. Monks and nuns tended to the sick, praying for their recovery. Medicine was considered as much a spiritual problem as a physical one. Surgery was a last resort. It was painful. There were no anesthetics, except for alcohol or knocking someone out with a blow. Barber surgeons, who cut hair and performed operations, handled everything from pulling teeth to amputating limbs. Infection was common, and many died from wounds that would be easily treated today. Sanitation was a major issue. People didn't understand germs. They believed disease came from bad air or miasma, especially from rotting waste. Rats, fleas, and insects were everywhere. Bathing was rare, and many believed too much washing could weaken the body. When the Black Death hit Europe in the 14th century, it killed millions. People were terrified, and nobody knew what caused it. Some thought it was a punishment from God. Others blamed strangers, the poor, or even certain ethnic groups. There were flagellants people who marched from town to town, whipping themselves, hoping God would spare them in response to plagues. The word quarantine comes from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. That's how long ships were held offshore to prevent disease from spreading. Despite all this, some remedies worked, often by accident. People discovered that honey, garlic, and certain clays had healing properties. Willow bark, used for pain, contains a chemical similar to aspirin. Herbal medicine, passed down through trial and error, sometimes offered real relief. The church played a huge role in health and healing. People believed illness was punishment for sin, and healing required confession, penance, and prayer. Relics of saints were thought to cure disease, and pilgrimage to holy sites was a common treatment. Some believed that touching a piece of a saint's bone or garment could heal them. Medical knowledge came mostly from ancient texts, Greek and Roman works translated into Latin. In universities, students studied these texts but rarely practiced on real patients. Medicine was more about theory than hands-on experience. Anatomy was poorly understood. Human dissection was discouraged, or even banned in some places. So doctors relied on drawings and animal dissection, which didn't always translate well to human bodies. Women played an important role in medieval medicine, though they weren't often allowed to become official doctors. Midwives helped with childbirth, treated injuries, and prepared herbal medicines. Some female healers were well respected. Others were seen as suspicious and could be accused of sorcery. Mental illness was misunderstood. People who behaved strangely were often thought to be possessed by demons. Treatment might involve prayer, fasting, or even exorcism. Others were locked away or cast out from society. Some monasteries cared for the mentally ill with kindness, but others feared them. Dental care, almost non-existent. Tooth decay was common, and the main solution was to pull the tooth. Some people used herbal mouthwashes or chewed mint, but cavities and gum disease were widespread. False teeth were sometimes made from bone, ivory, or even the teeth of dead people. Pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous. Without proper medical care, many women died during or after labor. Midwives helped, but complications like breech birth or infection could be fatal. Infant mortality was high, and losing children was a sadly common part of life. Despite all this, people did survive. They developed community networks of care. Families looked after each other. Village healers passed on knowledge, and slowly, over centuries, observation and practice began to replace superstition. By the end of the medieval period, things were beginning to change. Contact with the Islamic world brought new medical texts and ideas. Arabic doctors like Avicenna and Al-Razi had preserved and expanded on Greek medicine, and their works were translated into Latin. Hospitals became more organized. Medical schools in places like Salerno and Montpellier trained new generations of doctors. Even if most peasants never saw a doctor, knowledge was spreading. People began to question the old ideas. The groundwork was being laid for the medical advances of the Renaissance. Still, the line between medicine, magic, and faith was thin. And even in the darkest times, people kept searching for ways to ease pain, fight disease, and care for each other the best way they could. As we come to the end of this long journey through the shadows of medieval life, it's worth pausing to reflect, not just on the hardships we've uncovered, but on the people who endured them. Their names may be lost, their graves unmarked, but their stories echo through the ages in the ruins they left behind. The customs we inherited, and the quiet, unnoticed ways they shaped our world. Life in the Middle Ages was, for most people, not a tale of knights, castles, and glory, but one of mud, hunger, survival, and faith. The world was brutally unfair. Disease could wipe out a family overnight. A bad harvest could mean death. You could be born into poverty and die in it without ever traveling more than a few miles from home. And yet, people lived. They found moments of peace, humor, love, and meaning within the grind of survival. For the average person, life was deeply tied to the land and the seasons. The rhythm of life moved with the crops, the weather, the festivals, and the church bells. Even if they didn't have freedom or comfort, they had community. Villages were small and intimate. Everyone knew everyone else. They celebrated together, mourned together, worked together. In a strange way, that closeness may have made life feel more grounded, even as it remained fragile. It's easy to look back and think of them as pitiful or ignorant, but that would be a mistake. They were not us, but they were no less human. They loved their children, feared death, sought answers, and dreamed of better days. Many of the comforts we enjoy today's science, democracy, education, medicine, on foundations they helped lay. Even if they never saw the results, their world was full of myths, yes, but also resilience. They faced suffering not with despair, but with a kind of quiet endurance. When plague tore through their towns, they prayed, they buried their dead, and they kept going. When rulers oppressed them or war arrived at their doorstep, they found ways to survive. Not because they were heroic in the way history books define heroes, but because they had no choice. And sometimes, the courage to carry on is more powerful than any sword. Many of the worst injustices they suffered, serfdom, starvation, gender inequality, remind us of how far we've come. But they also serve as a warning. The line between comfort and collapse is thinner than we like to admit. For much of history, life was short, painful, and uncertain. And even today, many people around the world still live with conditions not so different from what we've described here. History doesn't just tell us what happened, it reminds us of who we are. It teaches empathy by imagining what it was like to wake up on a straw mattress in a smoky one-room cottage, or to fear the next winter more than any enemy. We remember the quiet strength of those who lived before us, and in the silence of the night, when the world slows down, there's something humbling about imagining the millions of forgotten lives that once moved through this world, plowing fields at dawn, whispering prayers by candlelight, holding their children close as the cold crept in. Their stories might not fill grand libraries or monuments, but they matter. They are the backbone of history. Without them, there would be no kings, no wars, no progress, just silence. So if this long, quiet journey through their world has helped you drift off to sleep, maybe it's because their lives, though full of hardship, carry a strange comfort. A reminder that humanity has always struggled, but also always endured. And perhaps that's the most powerful legacy they left us. Not inventions or glory or great speeches, but the simple truth that even in the harshest conditions, people adapt. They hold on. They find meaning in the smallest things. So tonight, as you rest, take a moment to honor them, not as nameless peasants or forgotten souls, but as fellow travelers on the long road of history. And may their quiet courage remind you that even in the darkest times, the human spirit finds a way to carry on. Good night.